On the 7th of October, 2023, after a 16-year blockade, the people of Gaza broke through the colonial border that was illegally detaining them in the world's largest open-air prison. Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, named after the historic mosque Israel callously targets every Ramadan, was a violent attack by a coalition of Palestinian fighters in Gaza with large participation from Hamas. Using the death of over 845 civilians, including those of whom their own government has killed, as justification,
על האדמה בחוץ, ממש כצאן לטבח מול הירי של הימ"מ שלנו והמחבלים.
הטרוריסטים ירו בהם?
לא, הם נהרגו מהחילופי ירי, תבין שהיה חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
זאת אומרת, יכול להיות שזה כוחותינו ירו בהם? כשניסו לפסל את החוטפים, את החמאס?
הם חיסלו את כולם, כולל בני ערובה. כי היה שם חילופי ירי מאוד מאוד קשים.
תגיד, אף אחד מאיתנו לא יודע איך להשתמש בקטלן. זו מערכת שאף אחד, זה הסמכה שצריך לעבור בצבא. אף אחד מאיתנו לא ידע.
היא בכוונות ידיים של אותו חייל, והוא מצביע לי לטור ואומר לי, תראי לשם פגז, יש שם מחבלים. אני שואלת אותו בחזרה, יש שם אזרחים? הוא אומר לי, לא יודע, תראי לשם פגז. אני מחליטה לא לראות לשם פגז, אנחנו מדברים על יישוב ישראלי. אני יורה אש מקלעים לכניסה של הבית.
The IDF was struggling to handle the Hamas fighters. Tuval Eskapa, or however you pronounce his name, a member of the security team for Kibbutz Be'eri, set up a hotline to coordinate between kibbutz residents and the Israeli army. He told the Israeli newspaper Haaretz that as desperation began to set in, the commanders in the field made difficult decisions, including shelling houses on their occupants in order to eliminate the terrorists along with the hostages. These reports indicate that orders came down from the military's high command to attack homes and other areas inside Israel, even at the cost of many Israeli lives. Now, much of the shelling in Be'eri was carried out by Israeli tank crews, as a reporter for the Israeli Foreign Ministry-sponsored outlet I-24 noted during a visit to Be'eri.
Small and quaint homes bombarded or destroyed. Children's toys lying around well-maintained lawns of grass ripped up by the tracks of an armored vehicle. Perhaps a tank.
Now, the Israelis want you to believe that Hamas fighters did this, but we know that they were only armed with machine guns and small grenade launchers.
Israel has responded with a genocidal campaign against the citizens of Gaza, which continues today and has taken advantage of the spotlight on Gaza to increase violent settler activity in the West Bank. Israel has killed over 20,000 Gazans, more than 8,000 of which are children, with over 1.7 million displaced. These numbers will likely be outdated by the time that this video is published. Israel is committing genocide against the Palestinian people.
יהיה להם לאן לחזור?
אנחנו עכשיו מגלגלים בעצם את נכבת עזה, אם תרצה, נכבת עזה.
מקדמים.
זו נכבת עזה. מבחינה מבצעית אין אפשרות לנהל מלחמה כמו שצה"ל רוצה לנהל אותה בתוך שטחי עזה, כשההמונים נמצאים בין הטנקים ובין החיילים.
זו נכבת עזה, אבי דיכטר.
נכבת עזה 2023.
בעזרת השם ובעזרת צה"ל, גם את ח'אן יונס נהפוך למגרש כדורגל. אני בטוחה שיהיה לחץ בינלאומי מתישהו, כן, אני מקווה שאחרי שנסיים את המשימה.
We know that what we are facing here is actually American imperialism and not only Israel.
Were there not an Israel, the United States of America would have to invent an Israel.
What are the talks of the Gaza ceasefire?
Regardless of Hamas's action that day, two facts remain. The first is that Israel is committing genocide, and the second is that such violence by the Palestinians on 7 October was an inevitability. Colonialism necessitates violence from both sides. Frantz Fanon, the participant chronicler of the Algerian War of Independence, teaches us that the violence necessary to maintain a settler colonial state can only be defeated by a greater force of violence. We know this from Haiti, the Congo, Angola, Vietnam, Ethiopia. 20th century Zionists also understood this. In his 1923 essay, The Iron Wall, Russian Zionist Vladimir Jabotinsky writes, every indigenous people will resist alien settlers as long as they see any hope of ridding themselves of the danger of a foreign settlement. The indigenous people here are Palestinians, and the alien settlers are the Zionists. So I don't see a point in condemning the violence of Al-Aqsa flood because of this. What I do think is necessary to state, however, that the fence was broken, the wall was breached. There is still hope, and liberation is possible. Since Vibration Cinema has a political ethos, it seems appropriate for the channel to speak about this moment, but also bringing up questions about the politics of the image. It's something that many visual artists, filmmakers, photographers are grappling with right now. What is the role of the artist? What is the role of the image during Israelis' continued genocidal land grab into Gaza and the West Bank? So today we are going to offer some responses to those questions using Palestinian cinema and media strategies as a reference point. I want to start with the 6 directives that the Palestinian Cinema Group tasked for itself in 1973. 1. Produce films by Palestinians on the Palestinian cause and its objectives. Films which originate from within an Arab context and which is inspired by a democratic and progressive content. 2. Work for the emergence of a new aesthetic to replace the old, one able to coherently express a new content. 3. Put the entire cinema at the service of the Palestinian revolution and Arab cause. 4. Conceive films designed to present the Palestinian cause to the world as a whole. 5. Create a film archive which will gather film and still photograph material on the struggle of the Palestinian people in order to retrace its stages. And 6. Strengthen relations with revolutionary and progressive cinema groups throughout the world to participate in film festivals in the name of Palestine and facilitate work of all friendly groups working towards the realization of the objectives of the Palestinian Revolution. This manifesto is colored by the defeat of the 1967 war, born out of the filmmakers' experiences as part of the Palestinian Film Unit in 1968, and is prefigured by the Argentine cinema politic towards a third cinema in 1969. When the first 2 points refer to a democratic content with a new aesthetic, it refers both to a fresh approach to the revolution and to cinema. It seeks policy for the uses of cinema in the Palestinian and Arab liberation movements, hence the third point, which calls to utilize all of cinema as a tool of liberation. The office of the Palestinian Film Group was located in the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization's research center. This formation stresses the cinema's subservience to the revolution. I clarify this point because I see a lot of people who are grappling with the efficacy of the image to meet this moment tend to either overestimate or underestimate the power of images. To the former, I'll say that if one tries to build a house with just a hammer, you'll be building the house forever. And to the latter, if you use a hammer to saw lumber, then of course you'd be disappointed by the results. Point 5 about creating an archive for historical material is one of the most common ways the image has been used by oppressed people. An archive is an articulation of self. We are here now and we have always been here, and this is how we've come to be. An archive preserves culture, history, memories, and knowledge, both personal and communal, and the archive of the oppressed catalogs the crimes which have been perpetrated against them. The Palestinian Archive was established in Beirut in 1976, but unfortunately, a mere 6 years later, it was targeted by Israel as a part of the war with Lebanon in 1982. Hadieh Habizne, one of the original archivists, and others have continued to do the work of trying to recover what was lost. Points 4 and 6 reflect a call for solidarity and socialization. The more Palestinian-produced images proliferate, the likelier people will come to understand their struggle, and again, the image cannot itself do this alone. By attending film festivals and linking with other groups, the reach of those images can be extended. Also, organizing with other groups means resource sharing and production help. Much of Palestinian filmmaking in the occupied territories is contingent upon Israeli law. In the 1950s, when Israel banned Palestinian culture productions that included films and signaled the closure of movie houses in Palestine. Because of that, Rashid Masharari could not officially helm the first Palestinian-directed narrative film, The Shelter, in 1989. To get around that law, a German filmmaker acted as the dummy director, and the production and equipment was listed under the names of Israeli friends and Palestinians living in Israel with Israeli passports. Another hurdle was to get Masharari even into the 67 borders. He had to work a deal out with a food transporter in Gaza to get a permit which was effective from 4 a.m. to 7 p.m. Because of the curfew in Gaza, he could not make the premiere of the film in Israel. Nevertheless, this speaks to the ingenuity of the Palestinian people, a reminder that laws are not totalitarian and can be bypassed. It's also a fine showing of solidarity. Some films, like Red Army PFLP, Declaration of World War, directed by Japanese directors Adaichi Masao and Wakamatsu Koji, are considered Palestinians because they follow Point 6's direction of working towards the realization of the objectives of the Palestinian Revolution. Adaichi lived in Lebanon from 1972 until his extradition back into Japan right around the Second Intifada in 2000. As a member of the far-left Japanese Red Army, he worked with the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, during his time in Lebanon. The Cinema of Palestine is a national cinema for people without a nation, technically. Some 7 million Palestinians are refugees, 74% of their global population. Palestinian cinema is diasporic cinema. There are Palestinian directors who have been displaced by the Nakba, who were born abroad as refugees. There's something to be said about how malleable Palestinian cinema is. It incorporates the experiences of all Palestinians, regardless of station. It also calls us, who are not Palestinian, to incorporate the ethos of a free Palestine into our own work, while we support Palestinian filmmakers by programming their work, critiquing their work, and helping to produce their works, etc. George Khalifi and Nerith Gertz outlined 4 periods of Palestinian cinema in their book Palestinian Cinema, Landscape, Trauma, and Memory. 1. The beginning from the years 1935 to the Nakba in 1948. 2. The Epoch of Silence from 1948 to the Al-Aqsa in 1967. 3. The Cinema in Exile from 1968 to the Lebanon War in 1982. And lastly, the Return Home from 1980 until about after the Second Intifada in 2005. Most of the information that we have on the first 2 periods are secondary texts and oral histories. The The films themselves are thought to be lost, some even before the destruction of the archives in 1982. Around 1978, Qasim Howell, an Iraqi who once headed the cinema department of the PFLP, met Ibrahim Hassan Sirhan, then a Palestinian refugee living in Beirut, who was considered the first Palestinian filmmaker. Up until this meeting, the general consensus was that Palestinian cinema started out in the late 60s with the PFU's work with the PLO. Sirhan, a self-trained filmmaker, traveled with cinematographer Jamal Al-Asfar to document King Saud's tour of Palestine in 1935. This is considered Palestine's first film, some 13 years before the foundation of Israel. A decade later, in 1945, Sirhan and Ahmad Hilmi Al-Kalani, Palestinian filmmaker trained in Cairo, founded the Arab Film Company. This was a gesture towards the future of what could have been a burgeoning film industry in Palestine, but that was destroyed 3 years later during the Nakba. The fallout caused by the Nakba and the subsequent Israeli laws banning Palestinian cultural productions basically halted Palestinian cinema for some 20 years, though there is evidence of Palestinians working on films in Jordan and Lebanon. Sirhan, for example, is credited as the cinematographer for the first Jordanian feature film from 1957 titled The Struggle of Jerash, but outside of a couple of smaller projects like Abdallah Kawash's My Homeland, My Love and Mohammed Salah Al-Kalani's The Base of Aggression, both from 1964, not much else exists. And again, a lot of stuff before 1982 was destroyed in the archives. The third period, the revolutionary cinema of Palestine, starts out very humbly in Sulafa Jadalah's kitchen, where she developed her photos. Jadalah would study cinematography at the Cairo Institute for Higher Learning, graduating in 1964 as the first female Arab cinematographer. She later founded the photography unit for the Fatah in 1968. The mission of the unit was to document events, justify the Palestinian cause, and to supply services to the press. Mustafa Abu Ali and Hani Jaharia, two Palestinian filmmakers trained in Jordan, would later join Jadalah in the photography unit. The Fatah did not officially support filmmaking, but it did not stop the photo unit from filmmaking either. With this leeway, the trio created the PFU, the Palestinian Film Unit, and would borrow equipment from the Jordanian Ministry of Information, which they worked for, to produce smaller documentaries. Jaharia was martyred in 1976. The PFU commemorated his life in the film Palestine in the Eye. Hiba, his daughter, describes the importance of his work in the 2019 retrospective, The Void Project, the found archive of Hani Jaharia in London's P21 Gallery.
If you take a look at my father's work, most of his work concentrates on Palestinian faces. And for so many years, people concentrated on Palestinians as numbers. So his message in the pictures were, he wanted to convey a very personal message that we are humans, we are individuals.
The Fatah's disposition towards cinema was fairly commonplace among other revolutionary groups that utilized cinema in Palestine. It wasn't really a priority for the movement, but cinema's utility was understood by Palestinian fighters who were inspired by the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, and other communist movements which incorporated film into the revolution. I think it's important for us image makers to understand how marginal the image is, despite how effective it can be used. In Argentina, a year after the foundation of the PFU, Fernando Solanas and Octavio Gattino teach us that film is merely a detonator, an excuse to gather and organize people. After the Black September in 1970, where the PLO was expelled from Jordan into Lebanon, the status of filmmaking became more marginal. The political leaders of the PLO weren't interested in film as a radical tool, but more in line with reportage. However, the filmmakers fought for the status of cinema in the revolution. This is exemplified by the PCG's manifesto that we covered earlier. Abu Ali states that the decentralized Palestinian film movement, coupled with its relatively marginal status within organizations, led him to try to unify these forces in 1972. The pilot attempt was a failure, but in November of that year, the Palestinian Film Group emerges. For more information on this period of Palestinian cinema, I recommend Hadieh Habizne's Nights of Cinema, The Story of the Palestinian Film Unit, a memoir chronicle of the time, which was published in June of this year, and Nadia Yaqub's Palestinian Cinema in the Days of the Revolution, published in the midst of the Great March of Return in 2018. The fourth period is the longest period. Gertz and Khalifi's book was published some 9 months before Operation Cast Lead, so the original fourth period covers from just before the war in Lebanon in 1982 to a few years after the Second Intifada, which ended in 2005. My understanding is that contemporary Palestinian cinema still falls under this banner of the return home. So while this period is not straightforwardly as explicit in its politics, meaning it is an agitprop, it opens itself up to the personal affectations of the filmmakers, meaning they aren't following a party line, they nevertheless incorporate their own politics. The films of this period are more cultural products of Palestine and its diaspora rather than a political organizing tool. The typical roster of filmmakers in this era include Elias Suleiman, May Masri, Rashid Masharari, Ali Nassar, and Michel Khalifi, George's brother. Because this era kind of moves away from political organizing and filmmaking, I'm going to leave a bunch of readings in the description below and not cover it in the actual video. So now I want to open up the field a bit to editorialize on how we can support the Palestinians' use of images and Israel's ongoing genocide of the Palestinians. The first thing that I want to get out of the way way, is the nature of propaganda. Propaganda is just a media campaign that pushes an agenda. Everyone uses propaganda. Propaganda is not lying to control the narrative. It isn't evil. It's not bad. As we discussed for Pride this year, the AIDS video activist propagandized safer sex practices and available treatments and how the virus does and does not spread, right? So propaganda can be educational and is actually beneficial to society. Propaganda is not trying to convince people to join your cause. It also focuses people already in your camp. BDS does a great job of this by targeting companies that are most complicit in Israel's crime for boycotting and outlining other targets for pressure. They explain in plain language how a boycott is a concentrated tool of politics and why they are boycotting these companies and not others. A boycott of all companies who support Israel is unsustainable, and BDS National Committee understands that. The agendas in this conflict are clear. Israel wants to focus on 7 October, as they self-admittedly lose support when talking historically, to excuse an ethnic cleansing campaign. But it also wants to distract from the ethnic cleansing campaign so that they can continue to genocide and ethnically cleanse the Palestinians. The Palestinians focus on the genocide because it exposes Israel's true nature as a settler colonial endeavor.
There is a place in Gaza called the Muassi. The Muassi is the place where they all can have shelters. Together with international organizations, we created shelters for the Palestinian people. So you cannot say Israel is not, facilitating that. Together with humanitarian aid.
This is where she's talking about. A desolate wasteland of sand dunes next to the Mediterranean Sea. There is no aid in Al-Mawasi.
It's called Al-Mawasi. It's exactly 1K by 14, so 14 square kilometres. It makes up about 4% of Gaza, Gaza being one of the most densely populated places on the planet. So it's about 4% of Gaza, and it would require 80% of the population to be there. If you imagine a car park of people stacked on top of each other, still without a toilet, still without a drop of water. So here you would absolutely have zones that are zones of disease and would become, in any sane projection, zones of death. So it's such an important narrative to break, this idea that people can just go to a safe zone if they wish.
The Palestinians focus on the longevity of this genocide for the same reason. The Palestinians also propagandize their culture, history, and heritage as a way to welcome people into the struggle, to prove their indigeneity, and because they are a proud people who are not, as some claim,
invented Palestinian people.
In this regard, Subi Taha, a Palestinian-Filipino content creator, put out one of the best propaganda pieces, I think, recently.
We're going to do a little Palestinian Arabic lesson for the day. Learn how to pronounce Gaza and Palestine. A lot of us are new to the Palestinian cause. Welcome, welcome, ahla wa sahla. So let's make sure we're actually learning about the people and the culture. Also, one of Israel's tools to ethnically cleanse Palestinians and erase Palestinian identity is by making Palestinian city names Jewish, alongside the appropriation of our culture and theft of our land. And this is really important to know because if you go to the Israeli territories, or what us Palestinians call the 48 territories, a disturbing and overwhelming number of the Israeli settlements are named after the Palestinian cities they were built on. For example, Bir Shiva, which is named after the Palestinian city Bir Sebe, or even Lod, I don't know how they pronounce it, Lod. It's actually Al-Lid, the Palestinian city of Al-Lid. After Israel was created in 1948, there was actually a committee that was established to make Palestinian cities and towns Jewish, attempting to erase any traces of Palestinian identity. And note that Israel strategically chose to do this because most Palestinian cities are ancient cities that have been there for thousands of years. The names have remained that Arabic name. They figured if they're able to convert that to a Jewish sounding name, they can claim indigeneity and say, look, we've been there for thousands of years. And you can tell because the city name is the same. That's why it's so important that right now, when so many people have their eyes on Palestine, that we are identifying the tools Israel uses to erase Palestinian identity and actively fighting against it by holding on and highlighting the Palestinian identity.
He weaves the history of Palestinian culture into a discussion of how the occupation tries to erase that culture as it ethnically cleanses the Palestinians. I think this is a good model for us who are not Palestinians to follow. By talking simultaneously about Palestinian culture, the longevity of the occupation, and Israel's current genocidal push, we are in line with what the Palestinians are doing. We must speak as directly as possible to the genocide. If you have to play 7 degrees of separation to get to the point, don't do it. You're distracting from the genocide, which is the goal of Israeli Hasbara. At the same time, it's imperative that we share information about Palestinian history and culture in spite of the occupation. focusing solely on Israeli crimes centers Israel, and the omission of Palestinian culture is a goal of Israeli ethnic cleansing and Hasbara. Sharing Palestinian culture and history keeps it alive, which is important to do as Israel bombed some of the earliest Christian churches in the world, the last university and public library in Gaza as well. With that in mind, we should not be talking about the camera as a tool of colonialism when it comes to the mass amounts of Palestinian martyrs that we're seeing. First, martyrdom in Arab countries is more akin to bearing witness to oppression. The sharing of these images is, in a sense, honorific in that regard. By pearl-clutching over the images of Palestinian corpses, we become complicit in erasing Palestinian culture and political heritage. We unwittingly fulfill that mission of Hasbara. This is another reason why Palestinians propagandize their culture and why it's important to engage with and listen to Palestinians. They do not exist, yet are cast as an ever-present danger, worse than the Nazis to the Jewish people. They are incredibly misunderstood, and while we may support them in theory, white supremacy is a motherfucker and old habits die hard. Understanding Palestinian culture smashes the remnants of those notions that we may have. We must also remember that just because something is made for a specific purpose does not mean that it has to be used in that way. Being stuck on the colonial origins of the camera is a failure of the imaginations for those rotting in the decolonial academy. Palestinians turn tinfoil into baby incubators and metallic trash cans into ovens. They can, have, and are detoning the camera. We should not infantilize them because we have internalized the logic of the colonizer, that the marvelous European mechanical marvel known as a camera is so sophisticated and we primitive people are so stupid that we don't know how to use it. This is a problem that the Palestinians don't have. So yes, there is a history of colonial images which fetishize dead children in bombed out environments from the global south, but that isn't what is happening in Palestine. The Palestinians are capturing and proliferating these images as documentation as well. Because of spotty power, internet, and storage devices, the archiving of these images is not necessarily possible for those under bombardment to do so. They upload them to Twitter very quickly for those of us who can archive the material to do so. It's not useful to just like these posts and bookmark them, but to rip them immediately to create a decentralized archive of these events. A Palestinian mutual of mine, Low Earthquakes, is currently organizing an archive of Israeli massacres to fulfill this purpose in a more centralized area. At the same time, the Palestinians are encouraging us to share these images of people gutted by shrapnel, burned by white phosphorus, and children torn in half because these images are radicalizing. I can't show them here because of TOS, but that is a good reminder that a good propaganda campaign targets different platforms and different audiences differently. It meets them where they're at and within the bounds of what can be done on a particular platform.
لدى العدو الإسرائيلي من خلال العمليات العسكرية التي صعدها نهار البارحة وحتى ساعة متأخرة من الليل. أنتقل بالصورة، طبعا هنا نصبح قبالة.
ريف؟
شادي
شو يلي صار ريف عليك عم تسمعينا؟
نعم.
يعني يبدو بأنه صاروخ سقط بالقرب منكم.
شادي هل تسمعوني؟ نعم. بالفعل شادي.
يمكن هذا الفيديو الأخير لإلي. اليوم الاحتلال ألقى قنابل فسفور على منطقة مشروع بيت لاهيا وقنابل صوتية مخيفة وألقى بمناشير بإخلاء المنطقة، وطبعا كل المنطقة أخلت تقريبا. كل الناس صاروا يجروا بالشوارع بشكل كتير مجنون، ما حدش عارف وين رايح ولا وين جاي. يعني احنا مقسمين، انا وكم حد ضايلين في البيت والباقي كله اخلى وراح، مش عارفين وين راحوا. طبعا الوضع كتير مخيف، المشهد كتير مرعب، اللي بيصير كتير صعب، ويا رب يرحمنا.
Some of the Palestinian journalists reporting live from Gaza have made statements recently about how the situation is so dire that they need to focus on survival right now and cannot report anymore. In his own statement, Motaz Azaiza notes that, remember, we are not content for you to share. We are a people facing genocide. We are a cause attempting to stay alive alone. The nature of social media and content really does have a pacifying effect, and we have to combat that. We have to recognize that each image and every number is a human being whose life was brutally, callously, needlessly ended by Israel. Entire families have been wiped out by Israel. Entire towns have been wiped out by Israel. There's a good chance that by the time this video is uploaded, some of the Palestinian journalists in Gaza have been killed by Israel. I wrote most of this next part before Motaz's resignation, and I think there's still value here, but I have tempered it with his condemnation. And it has to do with the efficacy of these images. How do you measure the success rate of these horrific images? What is their impact, especially now that those who captured these images have to stop because of Israelis' genocidal bombing campaign? I think that the Palestinians have proven to be an astute and agile people. If these images didn't work, they wouldn't continue proliferating them and encouraging us to proliferate those images. But to create these images obviously does take a mental toll. I think we're seeing that now. And the increase of Israeli violence makes it harder for those images to be produced. But we do know, obviously, that these images are successful because Israel is trying to create a situation where these journalists cannot make these images anymore. And it also cuts Hasbara desperately trying to sow doubt about these images by releasing BTS footage of Lebanese short films and using silicone baby dolls in an attempt to call all murdered Palestinians crisis actors, the old tired Hollywood defense. But these images are not going to free Palestine, let alone affect a ceasefire, and I did write this before Motes's resignation. During their underground tour with Hour of the Furnaces, Solanas and Gitino would stop the film when the energy in the room became electric. It was then up to Solanas, Gitino, and those they organized with to channel that energy into productive action and not let it dissipate as the credits rolled. This is the role of the image. You can have the most radicalizing image, but if you gather people and don't have anything substantive for them to do, this is not a failure of the image, this is a failure of your organizing. And the Palestinians have a policy of actions, including individual and collective, that people who have been radicalized by these images can take. Joining the BDS movement, buying eSIM cards for Palestinians, putting bodies in front of weapons manufacturers and seaports where ships are set to transport weapons to Israel, calling and faxing government officials, shaming those officials publicly, showing up at mass rallies, sharing materials which explain the 75-year occupation that led to 7 October.
على عهدي على ديني على أرض تلاقيني على عهدي على ديني على أرض تلاقيني أنا نهلي أنا فديهم أنا دمي فلسطيني.
Israel is a paper tiger, and it is important to demonstrate this as well. Breaching the fence in and of itself is a huge failure of Israel's omnipotent intelligence apparatuses. On multiple occasions, the invincible Iron Dome has malfunctioned and has misfired into Israeli territory. Israel doesn't want to lose the numbers game, so they don't send in infantry support units with their tanks, so the Al-Aqsa brigades can just no-scope the tanks or run up on them and get them with a grenade. Even Yemeni forces are stopping Israeli ships with ease. These videos demonstrate how weak the IOF is and how well organized the Al-Aqsa brigades are. It reveals why Israel is nothing without its air power, which is the exact reason why we need to stop weapons manufacturers and seaports here in the West by putting our bodies in front of the buildings and the ships and everything. Without flattening Gaza with bombs, their spec ops would be ghost. Israel estimates that there are some 30,000 Hamas members. They've killed 20,000 Gazans, and in their own estimation, only 2,000 of those are Hamas.
According to the AFP, senior Israeli military officials have said around 2 civilians have been killed for every Hamas fighter that you have successfully killed in the Gaza Strip. So that's 2 civilians for every terrorist. Can you confirm that?
I can confirm the report.
Israeli military failures are hidden by its genocidal bombing campaign, but this also very importantly shows that the Palestinians are not just passive victims to Israel's genocidal campaign. I'll leave my thoughts on the aestheticization of politics elsewhere, but bound up in that discussion is the aesthetic of images as a political artifact. We need to have more serious political education and see where images fit into the movement, not how we can fit politics into images. The theorist practitioners of Third Cinema, and the PFU is a part of that international community, were clear that practicality and efficacy is of primary concern. Iconography only goes so far, but indeed the Palestinians have created some of the most iconic political images to come out of the later half of the 20th century. Disguising their flags as watermelons after the Al-Aqsa speaks to their creativity and adaptability. The key compels a future where Palestinians return home, and the kufiyya, representing trade routes, fishnets, and olive leaves, is as unequivocal and simple a political statement as the hammer and sickle. Palestinians are a very generous people, inviting us into their struggle. They share their stories with us, they share their recipes with us, they share their garb with us. They've welcomed us to visit their homes when Palestine is free. They are not just fighting for their lives, but our lives too. In this moment, and over the course of 75 plus years, they have shown us the contradictions between the internal politics and the foreign policy of our Western nations. They've shown us pathways to freedom. A free Palestine means an end to nation states as a punitive apparatus and the beginning of a gracious, nurturing world. We must honor that hospitality and call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, full stop, in the short term, to struggle for a free Palestine in the long term, and then to start the actual work by revitalizing the land, facilitating the return of all Palestinian refugees, and keeping Western hands off Palestine. I'm going to link some resources, including info on BDS and other ways to get involved, readings on Palestinian cinema, and other readings on the history of Palestine in the description below. That's it for this episode. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free.
Shout and invite you to protect us. We want to live, we want peace, we want to judge the killers of children. We want medicine, food and education, and we want to live as the other children live.
We
teach life, sir. We Palestinians teach life after they have occupied the last sky. We teach life after they have built their settlements and apartheid walls. After the last skies, we teach life, sir.
وجعلنا الليل والنهار آيتين فمحونا آية الليل وجعلنا آية النهار مبصرة لتبتغوا فضلا من ربكم ولتعلموا عدد السنين والحساب وكل شيء فصلناه تفصيلا.
We teach life, sir. We teach life, sir. We Palestinians wake up every morning to teach the rest of the world life, sir.